I'm with Dennis Picard here at lovely Congamond Lakes on the border of Southwick and Suffield. And Dennis is going to tell us about something that a lot of you have never heard of. Ice cutting, a massive industry. I've read, almost like whaling. It was high.
Ninth largest industry in the United States. Number 9. It's equivalent to aerospace today.
Wow. So this pond that we drive by and people have cottages on was once one of the beating hearts of that industry.
One of the largest sites, yes.
Having been with him at many of his lectures. I'm going to get behind the camera and let Dennis describe what he's got.
Thanks, Dan. Well, the Congamond is very important in the history of the ice industry, but it doesn't become important until 3/4 of a century after the industry started. It actually started right around 1800, 1810, and it started out in the eastern part of the United States, and it started as an export trade. We were shipping ice all around the world. We were shipping ice down to the Caribbean. We were shipping ice to the southern United States. We were shipping it to England. We were shipping it to Australia. We were shipping it to India. India was a huge consumer of ice cut right here in Massachusetts.
Wow.
But as the decades went by in the 19th century, in the 1800s, people became more and more educated about how they did not have to eat seasonably. They could start using preservation with ice. Not with smoking, not with pickling, not with drawing the way it had been done for hundreds and hundreds of years, but with ice. So there became more and more of a demand for ice. One of the biggest consumers in our area was New York City. Our area? Yes, it was our area. They needed 3 million tons, not 3 million pounds, 3 million tons of ice a year. And they started by cutting on the Hudson River. And the largest ice company was the Knickerbocker Ice Company. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ice were cut by the Knickerbocker Ice Company every year. But the Hudson River got polluted, and you couldn't cut on it anymore. It didn't freeze anymore. So they had to look further and further away. And they started by going to the Berkshires, and they cut ice in Pittsfield, and they cut ice in Richmond, and they cut ice in Lenox. And then they had to look further and further away. And they looked at Southwick, and they looked at East Hampton, and they said, there's these big ponds. The problem is, how do you get it out of here? Well, luckily, in the 19th century, we had another technology, the railroad. And the railroad could haul stuff cheap. And the New York and New Haven and Northampton Railroad ran a special rail line right up to the Congamond.
Right on the other side of this here hill, on your right.
It's the bike
right by my house.
It's the bike trail now, but it started off hauling stone and hauling ice.
Unbelievable.
And one of the places they wanted to tap into was the Congamond. So it wasn't until like 1875, 1876 that they started cutting ice here on the Congamond. Using tools like I have on display here. One of the main tools, the important tools, was the ice saw. These saws were developed in the 1820s by a man by the name of Nathaniel Wyeth. And he took woodworking tools and he modified them so they would be more efficient to cut ice. He took a 2-man saw and he took off one of the handles because you don't want to be the bottom man on an ice cutting crew. And that joke goes back, I know it's been written at least since the 1820s. I've seen the 1820s, the 1840s, the 1860s. It keeps coming up over and over again. And it's always told about the Irish. The poor Irish, you know, they were the ones that people were prejudiced against up here in New England. Anyway.
You put the Irishman on the bottom of the 2-man saw under the ice.
But if you're a new man on the ice crew, you look at the foreman, you look at the saw, you look at the foreman, do you want to lose your job? Of course you're going to say, oh yes, I'll do anything else. Anyway, he also added what's called the tiller. Instead of having a handle that would come straight out, so you had to bend way over and break your back to do the work, he added a tiller, and he turned the handle at right angles. So now you could stand and you could row. And that's a rowing motion to be able to cut the ice. Well, in the 1870s, once the rail line was in here, we could start cutting ice on this is the middle pond, and then on the south pond, and the last place they started cutting was on the north pond, which is actually within view of where we're standing right now. That's where the last ice house was built. There were 5 ice houses here built on the Congamond, and they had a combined capacity of over 225,000 tons. Now remember, New York City needed 3 million tons a year. 225,000 tons is about a quarter of what they needed, but that's from one spot. So that was actually a tremendous thing to be able to draw them all from one area. Well, started off with the Knickerbocker Ice Company, then they found some other places to draw ice from, so it was bought out by the Berkshire Ice Company, and the Berkshire Ice Company operated it throughout the vast majority of the years of its operation. What you had to do is, no matter what ice company it was, is the first thing would be to clear all of the snow off the ice, because the snow acts like a blanket. It keeps the ice warm, believe it or not, warm enough that the ice won't get thick. And they would measure the ice. They would chop a hole with an ice axe, and they would measure it, and when it was about a foot thick, they would put out a call. And here at the Congamond, they would call between 400 and 600 men to come out. They ran special trains from Westfield. You get a special rate, like 15 cents round trip from Westfield. Great part about working on an ice crew is, sure, you work 10 hours a day, but you got your pay and you got a hot meal at the end of the day. So after the snow was all cleared, they would bring out the horse-drawn ice plows, and that would scrape, what they call graving the surface. They would scrape the surface, straight lines, parallel lines, all running in one direction. And then parallel lines running 90 degrees to that. So you had what looks like an old-fashioned grid paper, all laid out on the surface. Then by chopping a head channel, you had an open water that the sawyers, the low men on a totem pole, they would drop the saws down at the beginning of the line, and they would saw till literally, in many places, they walked out on the other side. They would just start cutting parallel lines. And then men behind them would come along with chisels called breaker bars, and they would snap the blocks off, 22 by 22 by 1 foot. And then they would float those blocks in the open water to an elevator using a pike pole. And on an ice pike, and these came from 4 to 18 feet long. And you have a pulling side and you have a pushing side. And the pikemen were skilled because they had to pass the blocks from one to another, one to another. If it stopped, they would refreeze. And that was lost labor. You'd have to start all over again. So they would be passed from one person to another until they got to the elevators. And on these ponds, there were 5 ice houses, each with elevators that reached down into the water. Think of a motorcycle chain or a bicycle chain, 2 of them, parallel, going around a gear in the bottom and having wooden slats every 22 inches. And as they came up out of the water, the pikemen would push a block in, and it would be grabbed by that piece of wood and drawn up.
I know quite a few bass guys that have caught quite a few big bass where those ice factories
Where the
once were.
foundations,
Foundations in
because
the
they're
water.
partway in the water.
Exactly, so
Yep.
great structure.
And one of my most prized possessions is years ago, there was a couple working on the North Pond where the last of the ice houses was called the Congamond. They each had names. And there was the, I won't go into all the names. There's the hygienic and everything else. But the last one that was built on the North Pond was called the Congamond. And up when they were building their dock, they actually found in the muck the remains of a pike exactly like the one I was just showing you. So we know, not just in theory, this is the type of thing that they were doing, it's exactly what they were doing on these ponds. And the ice industry continued as the 9th largest industry in the United States right up until around World War I. And then a company right here in Massachusetts called General Electric, they devised a small compressor that would run on electricity in your home. There was a lot of rural electrification going on. So you all of a sudden could have compressed gas refrigeration in your house, and you no longer have to have an iceman. So the ice industry gradually declined as it became more and more economical to use electricity. And even here in Massachusetts, by the 1940s and 50s, it was pretty much done. That's the latest you really hear people talking about it. So everybody remembers the blacksmith that was in their family. I mean, that's romantic for them. But everybody forgets about the 7 ice cutters they had in there. I mean, that's how much of a ratio you would have seen. Maybe it's not as much romance, but a very, very critical job to food, to the economy. Shipping vegetables from California wasn't possible without the ice that was shipped from New England and stored along the rail line on icing stations. So when the food came from the West Coast, they would be dumping ice into freight cars to bring the stuff back here. The Congamond was shipping 60, 70, 80 carloads of ice a day, 6 days a week, down to New York in July and August in the height of the season. And now, it's pretty much all gone.
Yep, now all we got are a few guys out there ice fishing.
Yep.
But this would have been bustling.
Oh, absolutely. And they really disliked people that would ice skate and things like that on a pond because it would cut bad grooves in them.
Oh!
It would mess up your blocks.
All right, Dennis, that was awesome.
That worked for you?
That was perfect.
Okay.
And it is the Corona, but this is a handshake.
We've got gloves on.
Thank you, Dennis. That was awesome.
You're welcome.
So we're on the southern end of the Middle Pond, Congamond Lakes, Southwick, Massachusetts, Suffield, Connecticut. It's in the afternoon. We got a declining sun. We're going to see if we can stir up some fish jigging here. And as far as historic places goes, as Dennis Picard told you, this is really the center of the ice industry in Massachusetts, with about 30% of the ice used by the city of New York heading down the rails every year to satisfy the refrigeration demands of the people of the Big Apple. And you can imagine back in the day when Congamond was much more rural. Southwick is still a fairly small town in Massachusetts, but Congamond's grown. You know, you see Saunders Marine over there, Kurt Saunders, owner, really good guy. Needs some work done, get over there. And here's our state boat ramp, kind of a cheesy little state boat ramp, like all the boat ramps of the state of Massachusetts. But you see the lake snaking around, heading north there. And this is the thing I want to show you. That's a particularly interesting little feature to me. Congamond, if you see it on the map, has got all kinds of little peninsulas. The native people, all across the eastern woodlands, from down in Alabama and Mississippi, all the way up here into New England and beyond up into the Maritimes, look for these kind of areas, these peninsulas, whether they be in swamps, in rivers, in lakes. This is where they like to put their villages. Guess what? The Congamond Lakes are named after the Congamond Indian tribe. So not only are we talking about the ice industry, we're talking about the Amerindian people of western Massachusetts, forgotten other than the name. I don't really know what happened to the Congamond Indians. King Philip's War got rid of most of the native people of this area back in 1676. And the Congamond would have been, by relation, close cousins to the Agawam, to the Tunguses in Connecticut, right over the border here. They were here. Then they disappear. Do they become farmers? Are some of the people here still possessing Congamond blood to this day because they assimilated? Or did they get kicked out into New York like so many of the other Amerindians did? Hard to say, but let's catch some fish. So I literally didn't even have time to set up the camera. I didn't have time. I cut it, I cut a hole here, and I was sounding how deep it was. And I dropped the little jig in just to get down to the bottom, and one whacked it. So, first I had a pickerel come by me. I saw him take a slash at it, so now I focused and I dropped it back again. I had a big calico on, missed him. Then I caught 2 brown trout in a row that were about 10, 12 inches, and I just missed one here that probably was 14 to 16. So whatever's going on, I don't know if the state just stocked in the open water over there. That's very probable. State of Connecticut just might have dumped a bunch of brown trout into Congamond South Pond. Connecticut, unlike Massachusetts, does a good job with the stocking program. Now, I let my 2 brown trout go. I know that's against ice fishing etiquette. It seems like every time you see a picture online of anyone ice fishing, they're keeping everything they get, which is a really annoying thing in the world today. I'm looking for the bottom. Pull a little line out on the drag and watch. And as that settles, I'll know I'm on the bottom, because the line will go slack like it just did. Now, I want to bring it up. Oh, an inch. Just like that. There we go. Oh! Something. Got a hit. Oh! There we go. And there is a little brown trout. Slimy. You know, you try to do a favor for the fish, and you wet your hand, and wetting your hand, you end up making it a nightmare to get this guy off because he's flopping and all over the place he is. So we're going to put him right back because we want to catch him on a pole, and we're going to now get the slime off. They're all landing on my ice. Now there's a better fish. So that's a nice brown right there. Nice fat guy. Look at him. And he came and he hit the little jig. Whoa! A fat little guy. He'd go right back. That's a rainbow. I let 2 fish go in this hole. That's usually not a recipe for success because the fish release the pheromones when they go into a hole, when they go back in the water. It's about 40 degrees. We probably down here in the valley have another week of ice fishing if left. It depends on the weather. It's been still going down below freezing every night. But this ice is giving way. We're going to be looking at trout in the rivers and jerk baiting for bass pretty quick. Up in the Berks, though, it's 1,000 feet higher, so I can imagine the ice actually lasting up there until late March, even April. New England's been getting cold Marches for the past 4 or 5 years. We actually have had years where we've iced off in February and then refroze beautiful black ice in March, which is very weird and rare. I remember in the 90s, late 90s, I'd be fishing in sometimes mid-February with a fishing pole. We didn't have ice a couple of years. And of course, the thing about ice fishing is how much snow you have on the ice. If there's a lot of snow on the ice, it can be a miserable experience. Ice is insulated by a snow coat, and it will also be pushed down, so when you drill holes, you'll end up with slush on top. That's what we've had here. If you look at it, it's this gray ice, and the gray ice, first maybe 3 inches, are condensed snow. We had about 15 inches of snow in Southwick a month ago, and it created a slush layer on top. It's not the best ice. Nothing better than good black ice. Hard black ice. Which they would have liked in the ice trade, by the way. As Dennis might have said, I can't remember. He used to talk about Congamond as having the best ice because it had beautiful green weeds. American milfoil, or coontail. Not to be confused with the invasive European milfoil, which you can tell because it's got those red stems. That stuff is bad, really hard to control, and it can choke out a lake. Not that it's bad for fish. There's a lot of fish that thrive in it. But remember the name, milfoil. Because if you had a water mill, you didn't want to get that in your creek, in your stream, in your river, because it would gum up your water mill. You'd be spending more time unstopping the mill, peeling off. And the stems of that Eurasian milfoil are very, very... There's a beaver. Look at this beaver. It's the middle of the winter, and Mr. Beaver is right there. Do you see the beaver? He's over there swimming in the hole. There he goes. Look at him. That weasel. Well, he's not a weasel. He's a beaver. But he's ready. Oh! That was disrespectful. What was that all about? I'm not doing anything to bother Mr. Beaver. It's pretty lame. Beaver. This is, oh, we're getting a little bit of rain. And that might be cutting short my afternoon. Couple of trout, missed a couple more. Got to see a beaver. I got splashed at by my first beaver in February, last day of February. Beaver's like a groundhog. What does that say? Do we have like 6 more weeks of winter or less? I don't know. Look at it.